this is my favorite kind of talk to give because the 8 of you that are here on purpose.
Absolutely.
You want to hear about this, so this is my favorite kind of talk. Also, it's okay for me to drink while I talk to you, which is really, really great also, because no conference that I ever speak at is 100% comfortable with that. So, cheers. Also, YouTube, this will eventually be on Cheers. Thank you. So, for the next approximately 20 minutes, I'm going to talk to you about WordPress polyfills, a very dry, terrible subject, but I will try to make it as entertaining for you as I possibly can. This is me. If you would like to be friends with me on the internet, follow my blog, follow me on the GitHubs, wherever. My job, as it were, is as an industry-sponsored WordPress professional. People pay me to work on WordPress full-time, which is pretty great. It took me a while to get there, and as WordPress is an open-source piece of software, wasn't always in that kind of place, but it is, and so I'm very thankful. So, for my list of accolades as to why I'm qualified to talk to you today, I've been a member of the WordPress security team for a number of years. I maintain BuddyPress and BeaniePress. I'm also a component maintainer for WordPress's roles and capabilities, which is kind of a big deal if you care about access control to various things on the web. And again, the companies that pay me currently are Pantheon and Pagely, companies that, unless you're a WordPress person, you've probably maybe never heard of, but they're really, really great. And so I will always give them a heads up, and they're 2 seconds on the screen for paying me. And then, if you want to perhaps support me and the things that it is that the solutions that I build and try to give away to the web, they are all GPL licensed, available for free. You can use them and not pay me a dime, but if you would like to support their future development, you can go to pluginsloaded.com and use any of the WordPress plugins that I help build that do all sorts of neat little things inside of WordPress. Moving on from the plugs. So I'm going to talk to you to try and make this as contextually applicable to CypherCon as I can about WordPress polyfills. And if you are unaware of what a polyfill is or why it matters or why you should be happy that WordPress has them, for the most part, they are shims. They are little pieces of code inside of WordPress that we choose to include with it so that we can improve the security of WordPress itself, even in environments or on platforms that may not be capable of that level of security going forward. It's sort of interesting to think of WordPress as a piece of software that's about 14 years old now, also running on 10-year-old hardware or software. PHP 5.2.3 is 10 years old. PHP is at 7.1 at this point. It's really great. But there are lots of web hosts, Bluehost, DreamHost, GoDaddy, many of them. I can name them. There's an infinite list that have lots of websites that are hosted using old versions of PHP. And that's okay. It's not really okay, but I get why that is the way that things work. And so eventually what sometimes happens is PHP gets better, but companies don't deploy new versions of PHP, but they do deploy new versions of WordPress. And WordPress will auto-update itself for minor releases, which means we can silently, pretty secretively, improve the security of things every 12 or 24 hours when WordPress requests a new version of itself. And so polyfills help us do that. The first place, if you cared about the code, again, there will be code in my slides, but it won't be all that fascinating, so don't be scared. But the first place that you could look, if you cared to look, is in WordPress's includes folder in compat.php. That file is full of weird little functions that are new to new versions of PHP that we provide basically one-for-one compatibility with. Some of these are hashing functions, salts, keys, weird things. Anyways, the neat thing about compat.php is that a lot of the functions in it, as well as the functions that come with pluggable.php, which is like one of my favorite files that most people that develop with WordPress absolutely hate. The thing with pluggable and compat.php is all of the functions that are in those two files can be overridden if you have a better solution for yourself, or you run a type of WordPress installation that requires you to have different hashing functions, more encryptions, weirder keys, longer salts, whatever the thing is. WordPress wants to be flexible and wants to let you manipulate those things or improve those things. And so I'm going to go over a few of the more common functions that are overridden or that are that we include that are sort of polyfills and pluggable, that if you run a WordPress installation and you care about security and for some reason you don't like the default security that WordPress comes bundled with, you can take these functions, write your own version of them, make it better on your own. And honestly, if you really do make it better, it would be really great to submit a patch back into WordPress to help everybody else's WordPresses get better as new versions come on. So the first thing that WordPress does to keep the web secure, if you will, is when you install WordPress, it goes out and it tries to get from api.wordpress.org randomly generated keys and salts. And so these strings could be anything. They are randomly generated, all sorts of weird. But the neat thing is that these are unique for every WordPress installation. I mean, as unique as we can make these hashes be, not trying to keep a log of everybody else's unique hashes. So it's not like we know if they're unique, but it's probably likely that they're going to be pretty unique. And so going forward, all the functions that I'm going to show off to you are going to use these keys and salts as a base for running their hashing through to make sure that when new things are generated, that they're generated based on these salts that are unique to your WordPress. And so it is really, really, really unlikely, like billions and billions of billions unlikely, that someone else's WordPress would somehow have the exact same weird hashes or nonces or things that your WordPress would have. And because these in PHP, if you're unfamiliar with the syntax, are constants, you can change them at any time. You can request new keys from api.wordpress.org. Or you could really insert them with whatever the things are that you want magically to be in here to make WordPress refresh and kill all of the other things that it uses these things for. So the first function that lots of things in WordPress that are related to, hashes and ciphers and security is WP-rand. Now, random number generators are not super great, right? I mean, the world of security runs a lot on random number generators, but if we relied on PHPs, would mean that WordPress would be unable to take advantage of new versions of rand when new versions or old versions of PHP are deployed on somebody's server. Or if you have, for some reason, multiple web servers, and each one of those servers might be accidentally running a different version of PHP. If we relied on PHP's rand, we would have environments that are generating different random numbers. And so WordPress chooses very specifically to have its own random number generator to go through and provide a pluggable, overridable, but still as secure as we can make it version of that. If you are familiar with the code and what you're looking at, it's kind of terrible, actually. I mean, the things that WordPress has to do to be compatible with versions of PHP that go back to 5.2.3, to be cautious of people passing really long numbers that aren't actually integers as integers and then try and rehash and remap some of those, recast some of those things. There are all these weird little gotchas and isms that over the course of WordPress being a mature piece of software has had to solve that are for the benefit of everyone that chooses to use WordPress as their engine to power their website. So some of these, if you keep looking, if we go forward, again, we have WP hash, which is really using, by default, MD5, which we all know is like not super great when it comes to creating hashes for things, but the fact that it's pluggable, if you see function exists WP hash, if you have your own function that comes first before WordPress loads and you've defined your own WP hash function and you want to use some other hashing algorithm, WordPress will yield to what you've defined. So if your WP hash function returns something other than MD5, it will let you override that and provide better security. Now, the reason we stick with MD5 is because it's relatively universal across many platforms all over the place. It provides adequate enough security for your 80-20 rule of people who really care versus people who don't. And if you do really care, we want for you to be able to override it with something that is more secure for what your application desires. And so it's nice to be able to have and own some of this functionality. I mean, it's like maintenance burden, and it's open source, people can see it, whatever else, pros and cons. But it's really nice to have this functionality. And even hash HMAC, if you're familiar with how PHP works, wasn't available until recent versions of PHP. And so WordPress comes with its own version of hash HMAC as a polyfill to say, okay, if you're using an old version of PHP, including like 15-year-old versions of PHP, WordPress will still work on it okay. You might get the occasional like debug notice or some terrible output if you've got WP debug turned on, but WordPress won't stop working. Some pieces will break, but it, for the most part, will work okay. And one that gets used quite often is WP hash password. Again, a pluggable function. You can define this for yourself. But hashing passwords for users or password-protected posts or whatever else is really, really important. And so, alternatively to WP hash password, or in addition to hash password, we also have, like, not unhash password, but validate password. I forget what the function is. To undo this hashing and verify that what's behind it is correct. But we include a password hash library that's actually written by the folks that make PHP Mailer. And as another open source GPL licensed piece of software that we're able to inherit inside of WordPress because it happens to fit with the ethos and the license. And they've solved that problem for us already. The only maintenance burden for us is updating new versions of PHP Mailer and password hash. When they release new versions of their software, then ultimately we can release new versions or new packages of WordPress with their version of password hash or PHP Mailer, which doesn't happen really as often as you might think. And WordPress is kind of interesting as a piece of software because it bundles many other open source packages and pieces of software. Requests, PHP Mailer, SimplePy, the list goes on and on and on and on. Along with that is WP generate password. Now, the thing I like about PHP, I feel like I'm cheating sometimes because I mostly live most of my world in PHP, is I feel like it's pretty syntactically simple. It's kind of like basic, like it's kind of easy, like you can kind of read left to right, top to bottom and go like, oh, if this, then that, meow, 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 letters pretty much makes some sense. But in addition to this function being pluggable, WordPress comes with a pretty sophisticated actions and filters API. And so at the very bottom of this function, you'll see we do apply filters, and then we pass that string through it. Which means if you were an enterprising plugin developer or PHP developer who wanted to override generate password, you could filter random password with your own return value and intercept that on purpose with something else. And so if you can't get ahead of this function, we want you to be able to at least get behind it, to validate it, to look at what the result is, and then be able to do something with that value. And so in many ways, WordPress is sort of silently designed to be as flexible from every direction as it possibly can be. And so there are, as you could imagine, security implications or concerns occasionally with this, but when security issues come up in WordPress, it is rarely this. Filters and things, that's not usually the thing that happens. It's usually a logic error. It's usually a developer who, with good intentions, wrote some piece of code that ended up to be vulnerable or susceptible to something that they didn't anticipate or expect. The other thing that WordPress employs literally all over the place, except for when you're a logged out user, the second you are off and you are logged in, then WordPress uses what's called a nonce. It uses kind of a poor man's version of a nonce. A nonce stands for tradition. It's a terrible acronym, but number only used once. And WordPress doesn't keep a table of numbers, so it's not like they're unique and only used once ever in the history of WordPress. And generally speaking, the nonces are usually good for 12 or 24 hours, so they might actually perpetuate through a user session or something else. But if you don't want them to stay static with your login session and you want nonces to be fresh at every single page load, it's a pluggable function that you can override. And that has happened. We do that on WordPress.org to make sure that everything that you're doing is invoked with the ultimate of possible intention as you can have. And that's what nonces do. They check for user intention. They say, this link, this URL on the web is unique for this user. If the nonce doesn't match, then you're not allowed to do those things. And the way that that works, it's an intention checker. Did you mean to log out, yes or no? Did you mean to delete that post, yes or no? Did you mean to delete that user, that site, that content, yes or no? If the nonce doesn't match, or it's stale, or you've had the browser open for longer than the nonce would take to expire, then WordPress isn't going to trust that request, and that nonce will fail, will not validate, and that request will not succeed. And so it's a way for WordPress to protect your content and your users and your posts and everything else. In the world of WordPress, where there are 60,000 plugins and about 5,000 active free themes in the public repository, even though we try really hard to code review and look at what everybody's doing and releasing and nonces are one of the things that are really easy to forget. Because you're deep in the code and sort of trying to make your plugin or theme do its thing. This is one of those things that's easy to forget. We have lots of functions to make it easy, but it's still easy to forget that you have to validate what it is that users are doing. And we use WP nonce tick, and then we use WP hash, which are also both pluggable functions. So you can have your own algorithms for generating unique numbers across all of your WordPress installation if you really want to, in addition to having custom salts and keys. The last thing that I have for WordPress polyfills is the random compat folder. And so this is something that WordPress chose to backport from PHP 7 and include with WordPress itself. It's a bunch of weird random compatibility libraries that PHP 7 came with to generate numbers and randomization of all sorts of things. PHP 7 comes with this by default. We have lots of plugin developers and themes that are using and relying on PHP 7 related functions, and so we want to provide that functionality regardless of the version of PHP that someone might be using on their server. You never know. And so what happens is if I write a plugin that relies on a PHP 7 function, and someone downloads that plugin and installs it on a server that's running PHP 5, if WordPress breaks, it's bad for users, it's bad for me, and it's bad for WordPress because it looks bad. It looks like something happened that shouldn't have happened. And as a piece of software, we're smarter than that. As developers, we know we can include compatibility for these really critical, important things and make sure that everyone that is trying to do their best to keep WordPress secure has the ability to do so. In addition to this, since start to run out of time and have time for questions if you all have any, and I figure this is somewhat relevant for the audience, WordPress historically has only had an inbox, an email address for filing or letting us know about security issues. We still have that, security@wordpress.org. You can use it. It will come to us. We will respond to you and try and help you out and figure out what it is. And that's really great. That's worked really well for us for a really long time. But the problem with an email address like that or an inbox is that is very few eyes that are allowed to see it. Only trusted individuals, like really trusted individuals, are on the inbox list that are going to get security issues forwarded to them, which is sort of problematic because the thing with security in general is you do want more eyes on the things that are critically important. It's just hard to get to a point where you know who is good and who isn't good and what their intentions are and everything else. And so over the course of recent months, and a company that I worked at a long time ago, Automatic, uses HackerOne for WordPress.com. But WordPress.org, BuddyPress, BBPress, GallotPress, all of the WordPress.org sites have all switched over to using HackerOne. HackerOne is essentially a sort of social-ish, network-ish thing for bounty. It's a bounty program for white hat hackers that want to responsibly disclose security issues in a way that lets open source, closed source projects, Twitter uses it, Facebook uses it, Airbnb uses it, GitHub, on, to be able to say, we found a bug in your software, we're letting you know privately, we are potentially patching this bug for you privately, and letting you assign a bounty to it to get paid a couple of bucks. In some cases, thousands of dollars. Sometimes $1,337, because it's kind of that awesome of a bug. And so if you haven't used HackerOne, or you haven't heard of it, you haven't checked it out, it's pretty sweet, actually. They've made a lot of adjustments and changes based on our feedback and other people's feedback over the course of the past 2 years. So the people who run HackerOne are doing a really good job. And so we have nothing but really good feedback. And so that is relevant, I think, to most of y'all. And then my closing statement is the reason that we use polyfills in general is because we have a responsibility to keep the web safe. WordPress is all over the frickin' place. WordPress powers part of the New York Times. WordPress powers part of CNN. WordPress powers all sorts of weird websites that you would never know or care about it powering. And so if we don't keep it secure, if we don't let other people keep it more secure, and we don't provide polyfill functionality to let other people make it better, then we're doing the web a huge, huge disservice. And so we include polyfills and make things pluggable so that the web is literally as safe as we can possibly make it. And my closing-ish statement is a quote from one of the Unix philosophies, which I will let you gloss over in all of its glory, which I think is sort of part of the way that WordPress, as a piece of software, love it or hate it, good or bad, reputation, whatever you heard, whatever you haven't, is applicable. And so if you are building something, if you're a tinkerer, if you're an engineer, if you love building stuff, you want to open source it, release it to the world, I think this is really, really relevant. It's important to get something out there. It's important to ship it. It doesn't have to necessarily be perfect, but once it's out and people are enjoying it, you've got lots of time to make it better. And that's what we do with polyfills. We try our best to make WordPress better every day. And thank you for your time. And I have 4 minutes for questions if anybody has any. Not necessarily even about security, about WordPress, about WordPress security, about scaling the web and security, about ways that I've broken both WordPress.com and .org on accident and taken the whole thing down for minutes at a time. I'm happy to share any of those stories.
Okay, how are we doing?
Okay. How did I break WordPress.com? WordPress.com is an interesting beast in that it still runs WordPress multi-site, but it reversed the load order of a lot of code because it would load the session of the current user way super early. Are you logged in? Are you an admin on WordPress.com? Can you see stuff most people can't? And so knowing that, I was like, oh, well, that's really cool that we have this, but it's totally wrong. Like, that's not the way that WordPress works. And so I spent some time cleaning up some really old, terrible WordPress.com code. And in the process of that, accidentally allowed every spam blog to get visited by unauthenticated users. And so I get a ping from Barry Abrahamson, which you don't want to get a ping from Barry. He has talks on the web, brilliant systems friend of mine, who's like, you need to revert that last thing. Why? It's totally innocuous, there's nothing in there. And Barry says, yeah, you've exposed all the spam blogs live. Okay, well, we'll revert that real quick. So that didn't necessarily take all of WordPress.com down, but it did spike traffic on every single one of the, 3,000 web servers across the world that powered WordPress.com at the time. So, my bad. Also, with WordPress.org, WordPress.org, BuddyPress.org, DuPress.org, WordCamp.org, GlotPress, all of these websites are on a network of about 40 servers, I think. Even API.WordPress.org is on there, which is incredible because it serves an insane amount of traffic when WordPress updates. But they all share users tables. And the user and user meta database tables are global, and they have their own database server clusters, masters and slaves, that power all of the users tables and sessions for WordPress.org. And WordPress has a constant that you can define to not let WordPress update global tables ever. Which means if there's a schema change, we add a column, we lengthen a column, we make it a bigger integer, whatever it is that we choose to do, don't update those tables. So the interesting thing with that setting is it only is really checked on multi-site installations of WordPress. And we were pretty confident that that was like all good across all of WordPress.org everywhere. There was one site that was a single site install of WordPress that was using those users' tables. And so on my sandbox, which uses live data, run it, commit it, deploy it, update bbpress.org, which at that point was a single site by itself, and hit it on my sandbox to watch it go through the thing, and instantly, Nagios starts pinging IRC, crazy, servers are like all of WordPress.org, all of the sites, API, everything, white screen for everybody across the entire web. I mean, we have that constant set. It's set super deep in everybody's sandboxes and configs. I kind of hadn't even thought about it in probably 5 years that, like, that was a problem that I would ever have in my life. And it's like, get the ping from Barry, did you upgrade user tables? It's like, I bet I did, but totally not on purpose, because I could watch it happen, so clearly I did, but whoops. And so it took 10 minutes for 8 million rows and probably 100 million user meta rows to like go through the schema update, MySQL to like chug through it, and blocks to go away, and masters and slaves to catch up, and go through all the thing. And so that was my horror story of taking all of WordPress.org down because of one line, literally one line of code. Whoops. So I've got 0 minutes. So thank you for your time. Appreciate it very much.
Thank you.